Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. Something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. On today's show, the Bucks get started in free agency. They add two names. One we suspect will play significantly more than the other, but two very intriguing names. So we dig into what they could provide, especially that one name, what it could mean for other players the Bucks may have been interested in bringing back, and what we continue to see in terms of moves across the Eastern Conference. We'll get into that conversation next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis, and we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us and view us on YouTube as well, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Camille, we mentioned at the top, the Bucks make some moves in free agency. We wondered what it was going to look like for a lot of teams. I think you and I talked about this last week too, is when is Paul George going to sign? Because that's probably going to hold up a lot of deals for a number of teams. And I think Frank and I talked about this on the show we taped Sunday night, but we both assumed it's going to be one of those weird things where if you're a psycho that's up, you'll see it in real time, but you'll wake up to something that a news report by Woj or Shams that was dropped at 3 or 4 in the morning that Paul George is going here. And that's basically what we got. It did seem, though, as if maybe there wasn't quite as much holdup as I think we anticipated. Part of that is probably just the players that were out there and the types of deals that there were to be made. But I do want to get to a couple of things about the overall scope of free agency that we've noticed so far, but we do have to start with those two names that I mentioned that the Bucks added. We'll get to Stanley Umude in just a second, but the place to start is Delon Wright. And this is one of those players that a lot of us had talked about as a potential target for the Bucks this summer. They were linked to him at the trade deadline. I think Chris Dunn was probably number one in the preference for both of us, for Frank as well, for most Bucks fans. But Delon Wright wasn't too far behind, and I think he checks a lot of boxes for this team. I think the tricky part is he can start, sure, but it's more of a spot starter, not even six starter type, a guy that can start if you need that for short periods. I think ideally he is your number one combo guard coming off the bench. That's pretty much where he's thrived throughout his career. So that becomes the other missing piece of the puzzle now, is you feel pretty good about this depth with Delon Wright and what he can bring. But now you just wait and see, okay, who's starting at two guard? Do you envision Delon Wright? Is it somebody that's already on the roster? Is it somebody else? So that's all part of the wait and see mode for this offseason for the Bucks.
That's the question, because as soon as I saw the Delon Wright signing, my first reaction was just, okay, not bad. Like, not bad. I didn't know if he was going to go for a minimum, slightly above the minimum. So to see him sign, pretty much day 2 of free agency with the Bucks for a minimum, I was okay, not bad, not bad. Not a starter. During his career, he's been more so a guy coming off the bench, as you mentioned, a spot starter throughout his career. But he brings in what the Bucks have been looking for, which is that point of attack defense. So Delon Wright, 6'5", as you mentioned, a combo guard. He has been around the league on multiple teams. I believe this is team, number 9 for him? 9 or 10 or something like that?
Yes. It's a lot.
He's been around.
That sounds right.
He's been around. But again, sometimes that just goes to show you as well.
Team number 9.
Number 9. Okay. Where it's like, he's been around, but a lot of the teams that he's been around have been playoff teams. Outside of last year where he was with the Wizards, and then he kind of fell out the rotation with the young guys and he was hurt a little bit. Then he gets bought out. He goes to Miami, and you see him in the first round of that Miami series. Like, of course, they had the Jimmy Butler injury, but he put in some real minutes during that first round series and had an impactful game as well. The thing I always look to see is how do fans of the team base that he just came from, how do they react to it? And seeing Heat fans just kind of like, what are we doing? How do we let Delon Wright get away? Like, how, and he went to Milwaukee. All this is terrible. Made me feel a little bit better seeing that reaction to his signing, but I do think he's going to be a useful player. The question that I still have for the Bucks right now, though, is who was that starting two guard? Are they projecting that this is going to be a chance that they take on him? Or are they looking at somebody who's already on the roster, like you mentioned? Is it going to be Andre Jackson Jr.? Is it going to be AJ Green? Like, who is going to be that starting two guard? Is he not on the roster yet? Is there still a move to be made for the Bucks to get that guy on their roster? But I think Wright is a really solid rotational piece. He's not like a knockdown shooter. He's definitely not Malik Beasley when it comes to that, but he's all right at the three. He's somebody who should benefit, again, from gravity being created by Giannis and by Dame, getting some open looks. And above all, he should be able to play some defense, not the level that he did a few years ago, but I think that he brings to the table a lot of what Pat Bev did for you, but a little bit taller and honestly, probably a little bit better at this stage in their respective careers.
So I'm glad you brought up the name Pat Bev, because I've seen a handful of Bucks fans on social media, on Reddit, wherever, just, I don't know if it's upset, but merely pointing out, I would assume this means that Pat Bev is not going to be brought back. And I would make that assumption as well. They basically check the same boxes. And I think at this point in their careers, and a few of the other things that we'll get to in terms of his overall style of play, Delon Wright is probably a better fit for you than Pat Beverley was, especially at, a player that's already beyond his mid-30s in Pat Beverley, and a team that is searching to get younger. You shaved, about 4 years, 5 years off of your backup point guard age with this signing. But look, I think the big things are he is a better shooter than Pat Beverley. It's, as you mentioned, it's not like he's a knockdown shooter, but he's decent enough. He can certainly knock down open shots. He's been a very good shooter in the playoffs too. He's played more than 40 postseason games. Celtics fans were quick to point out as well, he was one of the few guys that was actually really good in that series against us this past year. He shot 60% on threes in that series against the Celtics just a couple of months ago. But through his career, through 41 playoff games, he's a 43% three-point shooter. So, when we have the conversation about 16 versus 82 players, I don't know that it's a finalized product here that you can say, hey, Delon Wright is clearly a postseason guy, but his numbers have risen to that level in those moments. And that's the things that you would look for. The other big parts are, again, he's a better shooter than Pat Beverley. He's younger than Pat Beverley. And his size is the other big part of it. Is he going to be able to defend wings, bigger wings, threes? Probably not. That's going to be a challenge. But we've seen throughout his career, he can switch off between ones and twos and more than holds his own out there on the perimeter defensively. So in that regard, it's a pretty nice move for the Bucks. Pretty good value to get Delon Wright at the vet minimum for that 1 year. And since we're in the mood for just kicking around names and comps and what his role reminds you of, I think that's the thing to point out here. It's not so much his game that reminds me of this player, but his role with the Bucks. What you envision, at least, reminds me of what you had with Javon Carter 2 years ago and how you're going to look to use him, in that there's going to be moments where he's on the floor with Damian Lillard. There's going to be moments where he's spelling Damian Lillard and he's running the offense, and he's your defensive guy out there that can give you some of those sparks. So in that sense, I think that's another thing. I know Pat Beverley technically did that last year, but I just think it's another thing when we look for fit and what type of role will he play, that Delon Wright is going to provide more so than Pat Beverley would have.
Yeah, and I think the size piece is a big piece of it as well. I mean, being 6'5", it just helps, especially as a combo guard. I think that's one of the appealing parts of him as well. Like you mentioned, a lot of what Pat Bev did last year as well. But Carter is a good pull as well, just someone to kind of reference in regards to the role that they had on the team that we might see with Wright as well, because he's somebody who can come in and spell Damian Lillard. He can be the backup point guard off the bench, and he can also play with Damian Lillard. And we mentioned that before, even with Chris Dunn being at the top of our list. One thing that we've talked about was like, if they do that, like they'll be a little bit smaller, but like we trust in Chris Dunn's defense to kind of make up for that. But Delon Wright is 6'5". When you see him on the court, if you play him next to Dame, you're like, okay, I can see this working. It feels like a good fit there. And like you said, value. I think that's a great word for it. And the reality of it is we knew that the Bucks were going to have to be in the value bin as it is because of their current cap situation. I mean, second apron talk has been the talk of the NBA throughout free agency so far, with even the Clippers putting out a press release before Paul George even signed somewhere like the new CBA and the cap, and we tried and all this other stuff. So seeing the Bucks get right out that value bin, so to speak, I think that's a really good pickup for them. There's still some questions, I think, with the roster, and we did see that the Bucks are still looking for a couple of different more things that they mentioned after the press conference of drafting AJ Johnson, of what they're looking for. Still mentioned they wanted a big, they wanted some shooting. I feel like they got some perimeter defense here, as well as some guard size with this signing. So we'll see how else they target trying to get more shooting, as well as a more versatile defensive big in this offseason, given the fact that they're going to be value bin shopping unless they're able to make some trades.
Yeah, and Frank and I kind of kicked around some names on the show that we did last night, yesterday's show. The interesting piece here to me is how the Bucks use what we presume to be 3 open roster spots, how they use those spots. So this is one of them. I know we mentioned there was another move made. As we learned, that was a 2-way signing. So not quite as much what you would look at in terms of, well, now they have this to play with. But I am curious your thoughts on what are the goals for now those final 2 spots to fill those out, and what type of players should the Bucks be looking at here. We'll get into that conversation. And that other name that we mentioned, a 2-way deal for Stanley Umude. Thoughts on his game? I do recall very vividly watching him in one game last season. So we'll share some thoughts on that. And could this be the Bucks striking gold with something? As I've seen a lot of write-ups and scouting reports on Umude from when he entered the draft a couple of years ago, projecting what type of game he would bring. And the best case scenario is exactly what the Bucks are looking for right now. So we'll get into that conversation coming up next on Locked On Bucks. Well, it's time to talk to you now about our friends at FanDuel. As we mentioned, the sports calendar starting to wind down now. We all love sports and never want them to stop, but as those things start to wind down, you get fewer games, and the sports just aren't sporting like we all want them to. But FanDuel is here to keep the sports going for you whenever you want. All you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you are in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. It means something for everyone every day all summer long. Head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Camille. The other name was, we mentioned there, Stanley Umude, who had spent time with the Detroit Pistons last year. He primarily played in the G League for the Pistons, but was there at the tail end of the 22-23 season, and then last year played in 24 games for them. Collegiately, he's most remembered for his time at Arkansas, transferred from South Dakota. He was on that Arkansas team with the other Jalen Williams, and it was a tenacious defense. He was a big piece of it. I think a lot of Bucks fans probably weren't very familiar with him and saw the name and thought, wait, what? And especially since that was the first name the Bucks came out of the gates with, of here's who the Bucks have signed. And you think, I mean, I knew there were limited resources, but wow, how limited. So I think the first thing most fans probably did was you just go to look up clips and scouting reports and what can I get my eyes on here for Umude. and you see the very best plays, the tantalizing things for him. That's the thing about the highlights and those scouting reports is you see the best plays. You don't necessarily see the others. But I mentioned I went back and I found some scouting reports from other draft people from 2 years ago going into the draft. And it seemed almost unanimous that it was one of those guys that you said a lot of the talk we had about a lot of players in this draft of, look, here's what his ceiling is. It's probably a 3-and-D guy who could be able to, if he harnesses everything, he could be able to carve out a role as maybe a 8th man on the roster that's out there for defense. Pretty good shooter, especially in the catch and shoot form. A very good athlete, has very decent size as well on the perimeter, and showed a lot of switchability at Arkansas and at times with the Pistons last year, certainly in the G League. But that's what you would look at and say, okay, if things break right for this guy, he can shoot. He brings that with the 3-and-D aspect. He's a very good athlete. Yeah, he could be a very, instrumental bench piece for you. Is that going to happen this year? Who knows? Maybe. But I think the fact that it's a 2-way contract is where you have to temper your expectations and say, look, maybe you find something here. There have been a lot of success stories coming out of the G League. And the other thing, I don't recall if you and I have had this conversation, but these are the types of moves that intrigue me the most and I'm most in favor of for 2-way contracts, because it's a guy that has a little bit of something and you feel like, okay, we've seen him at the pro level for a handful of games. Let's really see if we can harness this and really treat this as, a developmental system, and like the minors that you see in Major League Baseball too. Those are the types of moves that I'm very in favor of in using your 2-way deals on versus, especially the first iteration of 2-ways when we saw the Bucks just signing local products or just the guys that you knew. I mean, best case scenario for this guy is what? He can maybe be your 13th guy that he has one thing that he does well. AJ Green, when we talk about 2-way deals and guys really developing, AJ Green, you have to start there too, that he started on a 2-way deal and carved out a role with his team. It took a year plus for AJ. So maybe it's the same in this instance, but I was really encouraged by this type of signing as a 2-way contract.
Yeah, a 6'6" swingman who, as you mentioned, projects to be a 3-and-D guy. And still in this NBA, 3-and-D guys, wing defenders, they are going to be high value guys. Every team needs them. I mean, we just watched the Celtics win a championship with a combination of just 5 guys on the court who can shoot, pass, and defend. So of course, especially people are copycatting, but wing defenders have always been in vogue. That's something that you need. What it makes me think about too is Ryan Rollins and Jalen Galloway are still signed as 2-way guys. With him getting this 3rd spot, makes me wonder what happens with Ty Washington. It seems like this might be the end of the road with Ty here in Milwaukee. I know that people had some hopes something could turn into something with him as well as a backup point guard for the Bucks or something of that ilk. But the Bucks seem to be going in on that wing defender, as we just mentioned. A lot of what you mentioned that he projects to do, I think, is what people are looking at with Chris Livingston, for example, 6'6", big body, someone who projects to be able to defend. But the difference is that with Umude is that we've seen him in a limited handful of NBA games, a bigger sample size, what we've seen from a Chris Livingston or something like that. And the way the Bucks are building out their roster is so fascinating to me right now because, as we mentioned, they clearly had some holes on this team that they needed to fix. We had questions about how they would do it, given the fact that they are in a pretty difficult situation with their salary cap. They don't have access to the mid-level or anything like that to entice some guys to come here. So it was what are they going to do? And seeing the draft with them going with 2 young guys who don't project to contribute much in their first year, seeing them now go and make this, 2-way signing with Umude, where it's okay, we are trying to see, hopefully someone in this group can pop for us because we're going to need this youth athleticism to come through. And it doesn't seem like the Bucks are rushing it, but it's at the same, it's we're trying to find some vets to play immediately. Hence, again, the Wright signing where it's he can definitely be a rotational piece. He can definitely be a top 8 guy in your rotation in the playoffs. But on the other side of this as well, we're looking a little bit ahead to next year, the year after that. and seeing if any of these younger guys that we're drafting can be something, because we see that potential in them. Like you mentioned, what we talked about with this draft, where it's a lot of guys who don't have complete games, but you see these outlines and you're like, if they can hit their potential, or we believe that we can teach them X and Y and help them unlock something, that's what they're going for. And it's a really interesting approach, and one that I did not consider that this new CBA might make the Bucks and other teams in the situation lean into a little bit heavier.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned that word of development that we heard JJ Redick really lean into that, and we wondered too, is this something that Doc Rivers and company are looking at? And certainly you're looking to develop those 2 draft picks with what the overall impression is of where their game is currently at. Umude is another one that you would throw into that category, though. He's maybe more of a, you can put this in the microwave versus you have to bake it. That I think that's kind of the timeline that it looks like he's on here. But all the tools that you would look for, you mentioned the size. He has a 6'10" wingspan. I know it's just college, but it's easy to get very excited when you watch a lot of that college film of what they did defensively at Arkansas and how he switched from really 1 through 4 a lot of times out there with the Razorbacks, and a 40+% 3-point shooter, albeit in limited attempts in those 24 games for the Pistons, but shot better than 40%. He's got a good looking stroke too. So very interesting move to keep an eye on here for the Bucks with that signing of Stanley Umude to a 2-way deal. And I mentioned, I did remember seeing him one game that as soon as I saw the name, I thought, that sounds familiar. He had a very nice game against the Golden State Warriors this past year. And I remember that because the Bucks were playing the Pistons either the next day or 2 days later. It was their next game. So I was watching the Pistons game to get ready for that broadcast. And this guy that I had never heard of was making plays. I think he finished with 15 or 16 points, hit a couple of threes, had some defensive plays in that game. So again, very, very limited, but he's shown flashes of it at the NBA level, and certainly in the G League, where he averaged about 17 or 18 points per game last season. So interesting signing made there by the Bucks. It leaves them, as of this moment, we think, with 2 roster spots, with no trades made yet. So let's just assume this is how this team is going to carry into the season. 2 roster spots open. Frank and I kind of talked about yesterday, what would you target? Maybe not so much players per se, but what are you targeting? I think everybody kind of assumed you get one of each of the 3 needs that you had. We knew they needed some backcourt depth. We keep saying they need a bigger wing and they need some help in the front court. So is it as simple as, okay, now you just got to find the best of what's out there for wings and big men?
It could be. It could be. And I do wonder too, because I've always been someone who liked going into the season with just 14 guys under contract, where you have that flexibility with that last roster spot in case something happens. But given where the Bucks are with the cap and everything like that, I was wondering, I mean, one, saves you a little bit of money by not having to have that minimum guy on that 15 spot. But also just thinking about, the Thanasis piece is so interesting still, where it's like, we know that he's been a member of this team, but the Achilles injury coming after the season ended, what does that mean for him in the Bucks this year? Do you keep that spot open in case something shakes with him later on? Like, just throwing it out, that one I don't see as being as likely. I just want to be completely honest at this point, but you never know, just given the ties that Thanasis has to the team, especially with Giannis being here as well, and just what he has been to this franchise during his time here as well. So I do wonder if there's anything with him that comes back around. And if not, looking at the market, it's like, okay, there are still some bigs out there. I did see Mo Bamba is now gone. He's going to the Clippers along with Chris Dunn, where it's like, wow, okay, you got two guys who Bucks fans have been clamoring for a bit with these value contracts. But yeah, the Bucks still need something. Like, a lot of the same problems that we saw with the roster last year are still here. We mentioned, like, hey, getting right definitely helps. It gets you that point of attack defender that you need. You no longer have Malik Beasley as a starting 2, but there's still questions around who's starting. We saw that the Bucks have had some news come out about them wanting to have a more versatile defensive scheme. Are there any young bigs or bigs on the market that can bring something different to the table defensively that will allow you to kind of start playing around of what that versatility might look like for the team? Is there anybody out there? I know you guys mentioned Precious Achiuwa before landing on Tillman, where it's like that would fit as well. So do one of those two guys sign with the Bucks here in one of those last spots? But personally, I would still try to keep that 15 spot clear, just as an in case situation. Who knows? Maybe a trade is made for one of the guys that we've mentioned, Brook, Bobby, or PC, where you might get two guys back. And again, having that extra roster spot helps with the flexibility there. So what I would say, target at least one of the other two. Like if you can get one of those bigs that we mentioned, if you can get Achiuwa, if you can get Tillman, go ahead and pull that trigger. If there's anyone else on the market who can give you some shooting as well, because I think that is a piece of what Malik Beasley brought to the table that the Bucks will miss, having that guy off. Well, we wanted him to come off the bench, but just having that guy who can come in the game and be an unconscious shooter, a high volume shooter at a very efficient clip. Like if you can find somebody who can also give you some shooting on that free agency market, I think that could be really, really valuable for this team as well.
Well, we'll save this for after the break because there's a few things I wanted to point out about that and clear up some things on the roster as it currently stands right now as well. And I think a few important pieces to really clarify with the Delon Wright signing. So we'll get to that conversation coming up next after the break here on Locked On Bucks. If you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and have to turn down the volume because of the shouting, means it's time to make the switch to Locked On Sports Today. It is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that is programmed for you every day, bringing you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, and it streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So as it currently sits, Camille, the Bucks have, including this signing here of Delon Wright, they have 11 players under contract. They did not sign either of their draft picks yet. So that's kind of the caveat. And you mentioned the two-way deal that the Bucks signed Umude to and what that could mean for Ty Washington. I do wonder if, because we've seen a lot of teams trying to force those second-round picks onto two-way deals, I don't know if we ever received clarification that this is not going to be a two-way deal for Tyler there. So I wonder about that. I would assume AJ Johnson is not going to be on a two-way deal as a first-round draft pick. But, the interesting parts about all of this in where the Bucks save some money is the vet minimum. So Eric Name clarified, we saw the initial report that it was $3.3 million for Delon Wright. And I think a lot of us kind of scratched our heads and thought, okay, what move is coming next where the Bucks cleared up some money? Eric did clarify it is a vet minimum, which is $3.1 million. But with those vet minimum deals, the league subsidizes part of it. So only $2.1 million counts towards the Bucks cap. So you save a little bit of money there. If you do sign AJ Johnson to a contract, it's going to be more than that 2.089, whatever it is, figure. But it would give you the flexibility then if you just do one and one is on a two-way. And again, I don't know if that's even in the cards. And if this was part of a conversation that we saw a lot of agents push back on and say, no, we're not doing a two-way contract. My guy is getting a guaranteed deal in the second round, or at least that 1 year guaranteed. But if you were to do that, then it would lead you to those two spots that we referenced, where you would still be at 14 guys and keep one open roster spot, but you would also save a little bit of money with the value of those signings, with the league subsidizing the minimums. And then in that case, I suppose it all depends on what types of moves they think are going to be there. You and I talked about this late last week, that if let's say Bobby Portis were to be traded, that's a move that I would expect to come later in free agency, not like late, like when the Bucks signed Brook Lopez. That was what, mid to late August, 6 years ago. Not necessarily there, but July 15th, somewhere around there, a couple of weeks into free agency after teams have seen, okay, we missed out on this guy. We missed out on this guy. So let's go get this guy in Bobby Portis. So that's going to be an interesting thing to monitor, because especially I think the one area where you could say what the Bucks do, let's say it's 2 guys that they're going to sign to the vet minimum here, 2 additional guys that could kind of tip their hand of any moves coming are, what if you sign 2 bigs, right? What if those names that we mentioned, what if you get Precious Achiuwa and Xavier Tillman, for example? Okay, now this is interesting, because that leads you to believe they've got something working. They got something cooking on either Brook Lopez or Bobby Portis here.
That's what make you think, for sure, because you wouldn't figure that the Bucks would go into the season with, 4 or 5 bigs on their roster. It feels like something would be happening. And Brook Lopez's name is the one that you're still kind of hearing rumbled about, with various teams having interest in Brook Lopez. And as the market continues to unfold, I think, as you mentioned, you will start to see where some of these other teams have holes and feel like, okay, let's actually circle back around. There are some really interesting teams being thrown out with interest in Brook Lopez, like a San Antonio Spurs, which is really interesting after like the Chris Paul signing. And it's kind of like, okay, what are you envisioning for this season? Not saying that the Spurs are going to be trying to make a big playoff push or anything like that, but just getting the vets in the door to kind of help this team as it finds its next iteration. Or you can look at Orlando, was a team that was mentioned before with Brook Lopez interest, where you see, wow, you got KCP. Like that's a really nice vet pickup who brings a lot of shooting that the team needs. As they are negotiating things, I did see they're looking to renegotiate with Jonathan Isaac, and try to find a new contract that works for him there. If those talks go sour, or if it's more than you expected, then do you make a move from, okay, we need to make another move for Wendell Carter Jr. We've heard the Lakers having interest in Brook Lopez, and they're trying to figure all kinds of things out. LeBron already came out saying, I'll take a discount if these guys come. Most of them are gone. So we could probably expect for Bron to get his money, but the conversations are so fluid. Things change a lot. So you would think, as you mentioned, if you do see the Bucks picking up 2 bigs, that there's a move coming. And even just looking at the pick of another wing player or something like that, it would make you really question, like, okay, what is this rotation looking like? What does it mean for a Pat Connaughton, somebody who we've seen play consistent minutes for this team as a vet? But last year you saw it slipping a little bit. We've heard Doc Rivers mention the faith that he has in Pat Connaughton as well. So he could be a Doc guy at this point, or is somebody going to come in and, make Pat's minutes a little bit less for him because they came in and pushed that pace for him and were like, I need to be on this court as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see that. I'm really looking forward to the summer league starting up in a couple of weeks as well, just to get a look at some of these young guys, especially if this is going to be the most extensive look that we get to see with them. And also curious to see if any of the 3rd-year guys are on the team, if we're seeing AJ Green or Marjon Beauchamp on the team, or if they're already kind of quote unquote graduated from summer league and they just might be there to support. But I don't know. It's really interesting. Like you said, I don't think for the Bucks, we're going to see like everything solidified within the next couple of days. It's probably going to take some weeks for everything to kind of settle in for the Bucks.
A couple other names that were interesting that we've seen throughout the course of the day on Monday that have signed deals. You mentioned Mo Bamba, so that's gone for the Bucks. Goes to the Clippers. Gary Harris, another name that was out there, and granted, I think a lot of us assume, well, Gary Harris isn't taking the minimum, and Gary Harris takes a 2-year, $14 million deal to stay with the Orlando Magic. Garrett Temple, another interesting guy that would have fit some needs for the Bucks. He signs a 1-year deal to stay in Toronto with the Raptors. And Goga Bitadze stays in Orlando with the Magic on a deal that's going to pay him about $8 million per year. So that's also interesting. When you mentioned the Jonathan Isaac component, they already have Wendell Carter on the roster. Mm-hmm. Are they looking to maybe turn Wendell Carter into something else in terms of a big, and Goga Bitadze at that dollar figure is your backup big? It leads us to the Brook Lopez conversation. Frank and I spoke about this quite a bit on the show last night, but wanted to give you a chance to share your thoughts if you had any. I don't know what to expect in terms of trades. If the Bucks do in fact trade Brook Lopez, we would certainly be saddened because of the value that he brings. And, the more Frank and I talked through scenarios, and even before we started recording, we were kicking back and forth. What are the realistic trade proposals that have been pitched out there by Bucks fans or sourced ones on the Brook Lopez front, and talked through those? And I just keep coming back to, regardless of how you feel about Brook Lopez, I don't know that there is a trade out there, at least among what has been proposed through the trade machine and everywhere else, that makes sense, that makes the Bucks a better team. There are trades that will make you different, but I don't see the trade involving Brook Lopez that makes you a better team. And, as we talked about, maybe you can get some switchability, right? Maybe you can get a guy that can hold up on the perimeter. What are you doing in the post? What are you doing for you bigs? Because again, it's not going to be Giannis. He doesn't want it. You can do it in the playoffs, in closing situations in the playoffs, but you're not going to do it throughout the course of 82 games. So you got a very big gaping hole to fill there. And all these names we kicked around, even if the Bucks, let's say, made a trade where they ship out Brook Lopez and they bring in just for S's and G's, they bring in Marcus Smart, where you just do a 1-for-1. The names that we kicked around, Precious Achiuwa, Xavier Tillman, even if you sign both of those guys, I don't know how much that really changes you, right? It changes your perimeter defense. It certainly weakens your low post defense and your rim protecting ability. I know Giannis can be the rim protector, but to me, the tricky part is if you trade Brook Lopez, I think you almost have to, in the deal, get a switchable big, get like a stretch 4 in the deal. So that's the guy that plays next to Giannis, and Giannis is the rim protector in closing situations. And among all those teams that we kicked around and said, well, this one makes sense and this one makes sense, you're not getting that anywhere. I mean, unless you say, well, Tari Eason could eventually be that. I don't think he is, at least not that stretch 4. He's more of a 3 type of guy.
Yeah.
That's the real struggle that I have with this is, are we doing something just to do something? Like even the Magic deal. Let's say you worked out a deal where you take back some piece of salary filler and Wendell Carter, and not to match Brook's salary, but just to get you under that second apron per se. I mean, Wendell Carter is a nice player, but he's a downgrade over Brook Lopez offensively and defensively. So part of me really wonders, for all the reasons we talked about before, of look, it's not the worst thing in the world to carry Brook Lopez into the season on an expiring contract, to have a $23 million trade chip that you can use. And if you can get under that second apron too at the deadline or during the season, you can aggregate Brook Lopez with someone else at the deadline to trade for another piece that would make sense. Or you just go into the season, play it out, and Brook Lopez leaves or retires or whatever, and that $23 million is off your cap. But what I'm most curious your thoughts on, the more I look at what has happened already in the Eastern Conference, there's no move like that for the Bucks with their roster constraints, right? They're not going to go out and get Mikal Bridges. They're not going to sign a Paul George type. They're not going to be able to add those types of pieces. That I really wonder if your best course of action here is to just say, I know the definition of insanity, but we really feel like if we stay healthy, we're still as good as any of those teams. And none of these moves that we would make, I feel like it chips away at what we have. So our best course of action, as much as people may not want to hear it, may just be not necessarily status quo, but largely status quo.
I don't know if there's a singular move that can be made. There might be a series of moves, but that feels like you're counting on a few different, things to break your way, where it's like, we need to trade Brook in a separate trade and then get Pat out in a separate trade. And then maybe like, it feels like it's a little too much going on in that sense, where it's like, there's no singular move that you can do with trading Brook Lopez that immediately improves you. Like you mentioned, even if you did do a trade where it's like Brook Lopez for Bruce Brown straight up, and you get a quality starting 2 guard there, it's like, okay, well, now who's your center? We've talked about it. This particular free agent market, when it comes to centers, wasn't a great one. It wasn't a great one. And then the ones that you would want, the Bucks couldn't afford. So it was a question of like, again, does Mo Bamba interest you? But now that's not even an option because he's with the Clippers. Do you want to take a chance on James Wiseman, who, is still young, but just has not lived up to that lottery draft pick that he was? Like, is that what you want to do? Is that what you really want to entrust, as your anchor in this situation where you are still trying to be for a championship while in the background, as we've mentioned, you have some of those guys for player development? Like, is that what you want to do? It doesn't seem like it would be what you would want to do. And to your point, I think that there is a possibility. You just go into the season and see how it plays out. You have a whole few months to see how it works out. A couple months under Doc, fully being able to incorporate how he wants it to be ran. A chance for Brook Lopez to continue to show his value across the league. And then you try to trade him at the deadline. I think what a lot of Bucks fans don't want to see happen is where it's like, you don't trade him at the deadline. You don't reach another contract extension with him at a better level that you would be more comfortable with paying him. And then he walks away for quote unquote nothing, where it's like, to your point, you get the salary cap relief for sure, because there's $23 million coming off your books clean, and you're going to get the little boost from the TV deals coming in. But you weren't able to flip an asset into another asset at a time where you don't have many assets in your cupboard right now to trade. So like, can you get something? Can you recoup something if he's not going to be part of the long-term term? So I get it for sure. I just, similar to what you said, I just don't want to make a move just to make a move for move's sake. Like, it has to make sense. And if you are moving Brook for a non-center, then there needs to be another move to figure out a way to get a starting caliber center in. But as we've mentioned, there are not many guys around the league that bring everything that Brook Lopez brings to the table, even though he is older and slower. The rim protection is still there. The 3-point shot is still there. His ability to score in the post is still there when he's given opportunity to do so. So like, there's value in bringing Brook Lopez back. I can see that being disappointing to some people, but you don't want to sell yourself short where, you're selling them for 75 cents on the dollar.
With the disclaimer that this is all reckless speculation here. When I look at Western Conference teams, that's going to be the interesting thing to me, because we've seen a handful of teams in the West take a step backward, right? I mean, the Warriors made some moves. DeAnthony Melton is, in theory, a nice signing for the Warriors, but they've started to really lose a lot along the way. The Clippers, you and I were talking too, like, what is going on here with the Clippers, that you're drawing the line here, but you're going to keep signing these other guys. They've taken a step backward. Regardless of how you feel about the Lakers, I think they've just kind of treaded water so far. But to me, some of those other teams, the Denver Nuggets, we didn't even mention, they took a big step backward. If you're a team like the Grizzlies or the Sacramento Kings, even, to a lesser extent, the Timberwolves, and we've seen the Thunder do this now too. Mm-hmm. The time is now to say, look, these teams are starting to slide back. The Rockets, those teams, the time is now to go out there and say, all right, here's our chance to maybe crack the top 3. And then who knows from there. We've talked through the Rockets scenarios, and I think of all of the trades that logistically would make the most sense, you come back to that Rockets potential trade for, in theory, Steven Adams and Tari Eason. I think we've all aligned on. I think the Rockets would probably push back quite a bit on the Tari Eason component, but whatever. The Magic one we've talked about. One other one we haven't talked about, and there is no sourcing on this or anything. It's just merely looking at the landscape of the conferences, what these teams have started to do, and contracts. What if the Sacramento Kings called the Bucks and said, we want to play, and I know it didn't necessarily work in Indiana, but we want to play Domas at the 4, and we want to bring in more vets, and we feel like now is the time for us to win this division and go on another deep run. We kept Malik Monk. We have De'Aaron Fox that's really coming into his own. We've seen guys like Keegan Murray start to take a step forward here. What if the Kings called the Bucks and said, we got a deal for you that we think is going to give you one of the things you're looking for, and it's certainly going to give you some cap relief here. It would knock the Bucks under the second apron. Harrison Barnes for Brook Lopez, straight up. Do you do that trade?
Now, that one was floated out there before, but it was with Davion Mitchell attached to it as well before he was traded out. So I was like, that one was kind of interesting to me to be able to get the young, scrappy defensive guard, another undersized guy. But Harrison Barnes straight up for Brook, for me, that doesn't move me enough to be like, yeah, let's go and do that. I get the salary cap savings for sure. Harrison Barnes is still he's an effective player. Like he can play some meaningful minutes for you, but for what the Bucks need and with his size, like that one wouldn't move it for me because I feel like that would still require a lot more Giannis at the 5 to have Harrison Barnes out there. And that just doesn't feel like a realistic fit. Like I get it for sure. But unless there's another move corresponding with that to bring in, like trade someone else out to get another big in, I wouldn't personally go for it. Would you?
No, I would lean towards no. But again, it's just looking through, okay, this would match up. This would seemingly fit what both of the teams are looking for. The challenges with it for me are what you just mentioned, in that it makes more sense in closing minutes of the games to have Giannis at the 5 and Harrison Barnes at your 4. And it's not necessarily 5 out that you're playing, but it's 4 out with Giannis, assuming you have a lethal shooter or at least a good shooter at 2 guard there. But yeah, that's the big piece, is what do you do throughout the course of the regular season? Because you still need a center to absorb those minutes so Giannis isn't doing it. And then if you get that, then you're telling Harrison Barnes, hey, bench for us. And he started all 82 last year in the last couple of years, but you're going to be our 6th man. So I just, and that's kind of where we're at with these trades for Brook Lopez, which again brings me back to, I think the best course is to not do anything and just say, all right, this really is our last shot with this group. So we think if we stay healthy, I know the Knicks got better. I know the Sixers got better. We'll see about the Cavs. I think their coach is better. Who knows what moves they make, but it could be very tough in the East. The Pacers were in the conference finals. But we think if we're healthy, we're as good as any of those teams. The real difficulty, and the last thing to, I suppose, wrap on here is, I kind of mentioned this with Frank, but let's say you move Brook, and again, Brook's been very good for the Bucks in the playoffs the last years. But a guy like that you would look at and say, well, he's very valuable in the regular season. In the playoffs, it needs to be in a tandem. You need him for moments. You need somebody else that can play a different style in those other moments. But if you move him, you leave yourself very vulnerable and exposed during the regular season for the bulk of those other moments that we spoke about. And as we just mentioned, in a conference where the Celtics are still going to be very good, where a couple of other teams got better, if you do that, I mean, think about what it was like the year that Brook Lopez missed 2/3 of the season with an injury. And this is a better conference than it was that season. So let's say you do something like that. Do you run the risk of saying, hey, we're fighting for the 6th seed, or we're fighting to possibly stay out of the play-in tournament? I mean, that is realistically on the table if that's the type of step backward you're going to be taking in the regular season with the absence of a guy like Brook Lopez.
It's definitely on the table. I mean, we were worried towards the end of this past season, like, hey, are the Bucks going to fall into the 4th seed? Because the math was mathing in that way where it was a possibility to see them fall down to 4. And it's like, we could have liked the 2 spot a while ago had we not gone on this losing streak here. But that's the thing with the NBA season. It is long. And as the games add up, and one of those random Tuesday night losses, which can snowball into a 2-3 game losing streak, can really come back and bite you at the end of the season, especially when you have other teams competing. You already mentioned Boston, defending champs. You expect them to win or to be number 1 in the East again after the regular season. You have Philly, which has a really strong big 3, and if they're healthy, that's going to be really formidable. You mentioned the Knicks. They also need a center at this point now with Hartenstein going to OKC, but they look like they're going to be tough as well with Mikal Bridges coming over there. You got the Pacers, who are going to be in year 2 of this current iteration with Pascal Siakam and Tyrese Halliburton kind of running the show. We didn't even mention Cleveland. We're still not sure exactly what they're going to do, but they're not going to be just a walkover team if Donovan Mitchell does resign there. And then, of course, Miami hasn't really done anything, but you always give Miami a certain level of respect, knowing that you can't just assume you're going to win against Miami. You're going to have to earn it. We mentioned Orlando, what they have done so far in this offseason with KCP going there. They can be better. So, like, it's a chance for sure if the Bucks aren't healthy or things don't break their way, that you do see them in that middle section of the playoff contention for the Eastern Conference, where it's like, you know, last year it was clear, the tiers, where it's like, it's the Bucks and the Celtics up here. And then it's another tier underneath that with some more guys or more teams that you think could push. But this year, some might reorder it and put the Bucks in that tier below, you know, the Celtics and the Knicks so far in the East, and the 76ers, even though that's all on paper right now. I do have a lot of faith in Giannis and Dame being healthy and what that does for this team, especially if they can really learn how to work together instead of my turn, your turn. So if people are feeling that way, I can get why. I still feel pretty good about the Bucks' chances. I mean, not having Giannis in the playoff series really changes the dynamics. So, like, if they can have health, I think that does bode well for the Bucks, but it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, well, and another reason I hate the Miami Heat, they've signed Keshad Johnson, one of the sleepers that I had, to a 2-way contract. But yeah, and look, not having Giannis a big piece of it, and I think it's a good thing for the Bucks to enter the season as, you know, viewed to probably finish 4th or 5th in the conference. Everybody's going to talk about the Celtics, the Knicks, the 76ers, maybe you have the Pacers up there, maybe the Cavs make a move and you put them up there. So the spotlight is squarely off the Bucks, and I think that's going to be a good thing for them coming into this season here. We'll touch more on free agency as it pertains to the Bucks in the next couple of shows here. Now that we go through all these scenarios, Camille, something major is going to end up happening later today or tomorrow, and that's what the next show will be about. Before we do wrap up, though, two last things. All of the news to come out of Boston the last couple of days. So, number one, the fact that they just kind of, oh, by the way, Kristaps Porzingis is probably not going to step foot on the floor until 2025.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like a pretty big deal for a team that just has Al Horford, and I know they kept Luke Cornett as well, but that seems like a fairly significant deal. We saw other contracts reached with other pieces of that team. I mentioned Luke Cornett earlier in the regular season or offseason. They locked up Peyton Pritchard for a couple more years, and then the big ones. We saw the extension for Derek White, and saw the extension for Jason Tatum, the largest in NBA history. There's one other big piece of news we'll get to in just a second, but why I'm bringing this up is because not this upcoming season, but the season after that, the 25-26 season. In that year, the Celtics are going to be committing $198.5 million to Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Drew Holiday, Kristaps Porzingis, and Derek White. 5 players out of a requirement of 14 are absorbing just under $199 million. The second apron figure for that season is 207.8. So they are going to blow past the second apron in 25-26. I think they have 3 additional players under contract for that season. So they're projected to be about $35 million past the second apron in the 25-26 season. They're going to be the most interesting test case for this new CBA second apron, because everybody knows more about second apron, has heard about aprons more this week than they've ever heard in their life. And you're probably more and more familiar with it now. But the second apron isn't meant to deter teams from keeping their own guys. Like, if you have ownership that is willing to pay the tax, and that's the other thing, they're going to have an astronomical tax bill. It's also going to mark 3 straight seasons they're in the second apron. So the picks are frozen and are going to get moved to the end of the first round. And you made me quick to say, well, so what? They're going to be good. So they're going to be picking at the end of the first round anyway. Yeah, that year, you never know what's going to happen 7 years later. This is meant to prevent you from bringing in other players. You can keep your guys, but you're not adding to it. So it all has to do with how much is your ownership willing to spend. They're going to be the most interesting test case for this to me, because I think if there's a team that can get by with this, as long as your ownership group is willing to cut that check, it's probably the Celtics when you look at the age of those players. It's just Drew Holiday that's going to be advanced into his mid to late 30s at that point. The other guys are just going to be hitting 30, and that's the big piece. If you have a young core, even if it's expensive, but you lock them up, it's easier if they're still at that level of play to fill out your roster with vet minimums. It's when you start to get down the path that we saw the Warriors get into, the Bucks may be in there now as well, when that roster starts to get older and older and older, and maybe you can't rely on them quite as much throughout the regular season. And as we saw the last 2 years in the playoffs, either that's where it gets really tough to remain at that level when your reserves and your backups are just vet minimum guys.
Yep, I definitely agree with that. Only thing I will add to that, Justin, is everything that you said is exactly why I can see that the Celtics ownership group is like, you know what?
Well, that's the
we'll put this team up for sale. Let's put this team up for sale. We're going to give all our guys some money, and we're going to make some money and get out of here.
It's a genius move when you think about it, because I mean, look, this is an NBA franchise. It's not like you're hitting lulls, but you are selling at the absolute peak right now after winning an NBA championship. I think that group bought the team for $300 or so million 20 some years ago. It might be a $5 billion valuation.
That was 4.5
Celtics. So you're making back a lot of money. And then the best part of it is what we just talked about, what the Clippers have started to do. You don't have to be the bad guy that says, well, second apron, we can't afford to do this. So very, very shocking, but you can kind of understand the logic.
I get it. It's the same thing with in Golden State, where Bob Myers left, and I was like, I see why you left at this particular moment in the franchise history. You don't want to have to make the Klay Thompson decision. I get it. You don't want to have to make these decisions as this dynasty comes to an end. I get it. Go ahead and get out. Get your money somewhere else now.
Well, speaking of the Clippers, we will be back tomorrow. We'll see what else breaks in free agency and moves by the Bucks. We'll get you up to speed on the rest of the chatter, other moves that are made in the East too, and how that could impact the Bucks. And it is also the finale of Clipped. So we will share our final thoughts on the miniseries and the key takeaways. And I've already seen people suggest, let's make this an anthology series, just like you thought you were doing Showtime. I want to see a Clipped on this version of the Clippers, the team that never really was. So let's get a season 2 on that.
Whoever they would cast for Kawhi would have the worst Tyler Perry-est braids. I already know it would just be a bad representation. So, like, yeah, we might as well. Like, we got to see this bootleg version of Paul George and Kawhi, and get all that story told as well. Especially now that Paul George is gone. Like, let's keep it moving.
We will keep you up to date on the latest on free agency, because it's probably going to be a pretty big week, filled with maybe not seismic moves, but there's going to be more and more that pops up throughout the course of the week. It always seems like we start to hit a lull. You get the first day, then it dies down a little bit, and then it's right around the 4th of July that things pick up across the league, and we expect it to be the same this year. We'll be back tomorrow with the latest on free agency and our final thoughts on Clipped. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.